Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into, well, a really fascinating subject. This huge global effort that's happening right now to revive Sanskrit,
Hmm.
to, breathe new life into it, bring it into the modern world. And you've shared some incredibly insightful material that takes us right inside this whole movement.
Yeah, and it highlights something quite specific, doesn't it? Uh, a critical conversation that's actually happening among the people who are really passionate about this revival.
Exactly. It's not just about whether Sanskrit should be revived that seems pretty much agreed upon in this community, right?
Right, the goal seems shared, but the material you've got zeroes in on the how. How exactly should it be brought back?
And specifically, it digs into this fundamental tension, this debate within the community itself about, well, about grammar.
Yeah, how should we treat Sanskrit's, incredibly complex and ancient grammar when more people are starting to use it, but maybe not in the traditionally correct way?
Precisely. It gets right to the core of what it means for a language to be alive or, I guess, revived. So the central question the material lays out is this. When you're bringing a classical language back into wider use, maybe after generations, even centuries, where it wasn't an everyday spoken tongue,
Huh.
do you have to stick rigidly to those ancient grammatical rules, the ones laid down by masters like, Panini?
Or does it need to adapt? Does grammar need to evolve and maybe even say, okay, this is how people are using it now, so that's valid, even if it breaks the old rules?
Yeah, even if traditional standards would say, nope, that's wrong.
And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to take that material you've shared, explore the different arguments it presents in this debate.
Look at the historical context it provides, too, right? About
Yep.
language change and grammar.
Exactly. And try to understand what's really at stake here. I mean, what are the implications of this discussion for how a language like Sanskrit lives on or maybe is reborn in today's world?
It feels like a small debate, but it touches on huge themes, doesn't it? Tradition, change, authenticity.
Absolutely. It's a real microcosm.
Okay, so let's set the stage. First off, we need to acknowledge something the source material itself really emphasizes right at the start, just the sheer energy and dedication already pouring into this revival.
The source is very clear on this point. It talks about tremendous efforts to revive Sanskrit, both as a spoken language and as a language in vogue. And it stresses this is happening globally.
It's not just a niche thing in one corner of the world.
Not at all. It mentions many educational establishments around the globe teaching it, promoting it, but also, importantly, countless groups, individuals who have taken up this effort as their lifelong mission.
Wow, lifelong missions. That's serious commitment. People really dedicating huge chunks of their lives to this learning, teaching, speaking, even creating new things in Sanskrit.
Yeah, and the source doesn't hold back its praise for this. It says quite directly, this is a very positive development and extremely laudable.
You can feel the respect for the passion, the hard work involved. I mean, reviving a language that's declined from widespread daily use. That's a massive undertaking. You're starting from a really challenging point.
Definitely. And you can see the results of all this energy. Sanskrit is becoming more visible. It seems to be entering the public consciousness, the cultural conversation, more than it has in a long time.
The material mentions specific things, right? Like it's getting into the mainstream media.
Yes, and becoming a subject of discussions and debates in various public forums. Plus, seeing more articles and books being published either in Sanskrit or about it.
So there's definitely a rising wave of interest. Activity is clearly picking up.
It seems so. Awareness, you could say, is definitely on the rise. People are hearing about Sanskrit more, seeing it maybe, reading about it. There's a certain buzz.
Okay, but, and this feels like a really important but, the source makes a critical distinction here. It's absolutely vital for understanding the debate we're about to get into.
Right. It draws a line between this rising awareness and the number of actual fluent everyday speakers. They aren't the same thing.
More people know about it, but that doesn't automatically mean a huge surge in people using it fluently all the time.
Exactly. The source anchors this with a specific statistic. It mentions a 2001 Wikipedia note citing around 14,000 people in India listing Sanskrit as their first language.
14,000
Yeah.
back in 2001.
Yeah, and while the source acknowledges that number might well have grown since then.
You'd hope so, with all the effort.
Right, but its estimation is, even if you imagine, say, a tenfold increase, which would be pretty remarkable growth,
That'd be 140,000.
still minuscule when you think about the population of India or globally. It's certainly, as the source puts it, not a critical mass of native fluent speakers, like you'd find in a language that's evolving naturally through widespread daily use.
And it makes another really crucial clarification too, doesn't it, about all the people learning it?
Yes. The thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands worldwide, who are attending classes, seminars, weekend camps, online courses. Their enthusiasm is fantastic, obviously, for raising awareness and interest.
But they don't necessarily count as Sanskrit-speaking people in the sense that's relevant for how languages usually evolve. Is that the point?
That's exactly it. They are learners, students, enthusiasts. They're acquiring the language. And that's a fundamentally different linguistic situation from being a native speaker, someone who soaked up its rules and patterns from birth through constant natural exposure.
Okay. That distinction feels really important for what comes next.
It's key to the counter-argument later, definitely. But it's also key to understanding why this whole debate is happening in the first place. It's precisely this increase in usage, even if it's mainly by these enthusiastic non-native speakers and learners, that seems to be driving the discussion.
So the activity itself sparks the question. The source says this rise in usage has led to some voices calling to essentially upgrade the language, revise its structure, to keep it current with the changing times.
Right. And the reason people are calling for this upgrade, this change to the grammar, is pretty simple. It comes directly from how these new users are actually using the language.
They're making mistakes, basically, or using it in ways that don't fit the old rules.
Essentially, yes. People, especially learners or those re-engaging without being native speakers, are using certain phrases or grammatical constructions that, if you measure them against the established classical Sanskrit grammar, well, they have no grammatical basis.
So, by classical standards, they're just incorrect. But they're becoming common because more people, mostly learners, are using them.
That seems to be the situation, and it forces this question. What do these incorrect usages actually look like? What kinds of errors are becoming common enough to spark a debate about changing the rules?
Good point. Abstract discussion only gets you so far. The source gives concrete examples, which helps a lot. Let's get into those.
Okay. The first one mentioned is the phrase, Don Bandakebri Mams Maraya. The source says this is being used now, presumably by modern speakers trying to say, remind me.
Okay, mam smaraya for remind me. But that's not right, according to classical grammar.
Nope. The classically correct way, the source states, would be Hadia Akantere Maya Smaraya.
Mam versus Maya. Okay, I'm not a Sanskrit expert, but that sounds like a difference in case endings, maybe. Like accusative versus something else.
You've got it. It's exactly about case usage, really fundamental part of Sanskrit grammar. Mam, Atari, is the accusative form of I, like the direct object me. Maya, atai, is the instrumental case often used for the agent or the means by me or with specific verbs.
So the verb here, smaraya, meaning to remind or cause to remember, it takes the instrumental case for the person being reminded.
Classically, yes. It seems the construction is more like remembrance is caused by me using instrumental maya rather than cause me to remember using accusative mam.
I see. So modern users might be defaulting to mam because, well, in English we say remind me, where me feels like a direct object. Or maybe other Sanskrit verbs work that way.
Both are likely influences. It's easier, perhaps, to map it onto a more common pattern, either from one's native language or even from other Sanskrit verbs, rather than learning the specific, maybe less intuitive rule for this particular causative verb construction.
Okay, that makes sense. An understandable error for a learner, applying a familiar pattern where a specific different rule exists. What's the next example?
The source gives Kozan Dekat Shoa.
Sarvesham nama. This is apparently being used now probably as a general greeting, like salutations to everyone.
Sarvesham nama. That sounds plausible, but, again, incorrect.
According to classical grammar, yes. The correct form is Akarchan Sarvesham nama.
Sarvesham versus Sarvesham, again, looks like case endings on Sarve, everyone.
Exactly. Sarvesham is the genitive plural meaning of everyone. Sarveshya is the dative plural meaning to everyone or for everyone.
And the word nama, meaning salutation or obeisance. Right? Nama is what's called an indeclinable or particle, and classically, it governs the dative case. It requires the noun or pronoun it's directed towards to be in the dative.
So a salutu. A saluko literally means salutations to everyone. Makes perfect sense.
Whereas using the genitive pathaliotu is grammatically incorrect for this specific phrase. It's like saying salutations of everyone instead of salutations to everyone.
Yeah.
It just doesn't fit the rule for nama.
Another case where modern users might be defaulting to a common pattern of relationships are everywhere and missing the specific dative requirement here.
Seems likely. Again, an understandable slip for someone learning or not deeply immersed in classical usage.
Okay, one more example was mentioned.
Yes, the source points to hariam being commonly used or written. But the correct classical form, taking into account the rules of sound combination, is hari haram.
Hari om versus hari om. This sounds like sandhi, doesn't it? Those complex rules in Sanskrit about how sounds change when words meet.
Precisely. Sandhi is a hallmark of Sanskrit's phonetic precision. This specific instance involves Visarga sandhi.
Visarga, that H sound often written as...
Right. The word hari, in its standalone form, ends with that Visarga. Classical sandhi rules dictate exactly how that final H sound interacts with the next sound, in this case, the vowel O in om.
And the rules say you should keep the H sound or modify it in a specific way before om.
Essentially, yes. Without getting lost in the specific rule, the correct application results in hari om, maintaining the Visarga sound or related change before the om. Just dropping it entirely and saying or writing hari om is a simplification.
A common one, perhaps, especially in more casual or devotional setting.
Very common, yes. But technically, it ignores a key phonetic and grammatical rule that connects the two words according to the classical system.
Got it. So these examples are really helpful. They show us exactly what the source means by discrepancies common modern ways of speaking that just don't line up with the detailed established rules of classical grammar. And it's these widespread, technically incorrect usages that are fueling the debate. Which brings us to the perspective of those the source calls the be-modern enthusiast grammarians.
Yes. Their argument, as the source lays it out, is pretty pragmatic. It's rooted in the reality of this increasing usage. They look around and see that, well, everyone nowadays uses such phrases.
Meaning these incorrect forms are becoming standard practice among the growing number of people engaging with Sanskrit.
Right. So given that this is happening, they argue there needs to be a way in the grammar books to justify these kind of usages. Or maybe the grammar books themselves need to be updated to include such usages, perhaps as valid alternatives or accepted modern forms.
And the justification for updating the grammar is tied directly to the revival itself.
Yes, their reasoning is that this is necessary, especially when the use of Sanskrit has increased. The underlying idea seems to be, if a language is genuinely growing, if more people are using it, shouldn't the grammar reflect how it's actually being spoken and written, even if that's different from rules set down centuries ago?
It's sort of a descriptive versus prescriptive view of grammar applied to a revival situation.
Exactly. They see grammar's role, at least partly, as describing the language as it is used, especially when that usage is expanding.
And they don't just pull this idea out of thin air, right? The source says they ground this argument in a traditional principle from within Sanskrit grammar itself.
Correct. They cite a specific Sanskrit phrase, kind of maxim, among traditional grammarians. And after it is a bilis buning. Prayoga sharana vaya karana.
Prayoga sharana vaya karana. And the source gives the meaning as essentially grammarians go as per the usage.
Right. Grammarians follow usage. And the interpretation put forward by this side of the debate based on that principle is quite clear. The language comes first, the grammar rules go according to usage.
So language leads, grammar follows.
That's the core idea. And it forms the foundation for their argument that now that Sanskrit usage is picking up again, the grammar should adapt to reflect and validate how people are using it now, because that's the traditional role of the grammarian to describe usage.
And they find support for this idea in the history of Sanskrit grammar itself. They argue this isn't some radical new proposal.
Exactly. The source indicates they point to historical examples. First, the foundational work itself, the Panini Sutras.
Panini's grammar, the bedrock of classical Sanskrit.
Yes. The point made is that Panini wasn't seen as just inventing rules arbitrarily. His monumental work is understood as defining the general rules of usage that he observed in the sophisticated, communicative Sanskrit spoken and written by the educated people of his time.
So his grammar was, in a way, a snapshot, a very detailed one of the language as it was actually used then. Descriptive, not purely prescriptive from the start.
That's the interpretation, and it goes further. The source mentions that even within Panini's incredibly systematic rules, there are acknowledged exceptions to those general rules.
So even Panini noted cases where usage didn't quite fit the general pattern.
Apparently so. Which suggests that specific usage patterns were observed and recorded, even if they deviated from the broader principles he was outlining. Grammar was already acknowledging variations in usage.
And this continued after Panini, with the Vartikas.
Yes, the source mentions the Vartikas.
Okay.
These were later commentaries and analyses, famously by Katyana, who looked critically at Panini's work centuries later. Part of their function, the source notes, was to include some corrections or more usage styles.
Styles that had emerged or become more common after Panini?
Exactly. Or perhaps to refine how Panini's rules applied based on continued observation of usage. This shows, they argue, a historical process. Grammatical understanding did interact with and adapt to how the language was actually being used over time.
So the picture they paint is not of Sanskrit grammar as some static, unchanging monument.
No, but rather as something that historically had a dynamic relationship with the living, breathing language. It evolved alongside usage.
Okay, so summing up this side. Adapting grammar to current usage isn't breaking tradition. It is the tradition, following the principle of prayoga sharana vyakarana. And it's necessary now because usage is increasing, and grammar needs to reflect that to keep the language alive and relevant. Clinging rigidly to ancient rules when new patterns emerge is, from this view, actually counterproductive to the revival effort.
That seems to capture their perspective well. It's a logical argument based on precedent and practicality.
It does sound compelling. If grammarians follow usage and usage is changing and growing, then grammar should follow. Makes sense. But the source material doesn't leave it there, does it? There's a significant, however.
Yes, a very significant one. The source pivots here, introducing a strong counterargument with the line, however, in this zeal of revival, we should be knowing where we stand and what we are doing.
That sounds like a call for caution, a reality check.
Precisely. It's not dismissing the revival efforts, it already lauded them, but it's saying, hold on, before we jump to applying historical principles about grammar change, let's look really carefully at the current situation of Sanskrit. The implication is, today's context is fundamentally different from the historical one where those principles applied.
And the core of this counterargument seems to be a much deeper dive into that distinction we touched on earlier, awareness versus actual fluent speakers.
Yes, it revisits and really hammers home the point about the current user base. It stresses emphatically that the vast majority of current speakers, including grammarians and learners, do not have Sanskrit as their mother tongue, the language they learn naturally from childhood at home.
They're overwhelmingly second language learners. No matter how good they get, it's different from being a native speaker.
That's the argument, and this is a stark, undeniable contrast to the historical situation Panini or the Vartikakars were in, where they were analyzing the usage of a large, presumably native-speaking population.
And this lack of native speakers has consequences, according to the source, even for the grammarians themselves.
Yes, the source points out that because there isn't this living native-speaking environment to draw on, even the knowledge of many modern grammarians can be primarily confined to the rules and examples given in the classic treatises. Their expertise comes from intense study of text, Panini, commentaries, dictionaries.
Not from that deep, intuitive feel you get from growing up with the language.
Exactly. And the source suggests this text-based knowledge, while incredibly valuable, sometimes hits the dead end in analyzing and applying various sutras. It lacks that instinctive linguistic intuition that a native speaker or a grammarian surrounded by native speakers might possess. They know the rules academically, but applying them creatively or judging subtle usage nuances can be harder without that native grounding.
Okay, so that's the grammarians. What about the learners, the majority of people using Sanskrit now?
Here, the source is even more direct. It states clearly that their usage is heavily influenced by grammatical constructs and their usages in their native languages.
So that's why those incorrect examples are cropping up, like using mam instead of maya or sarvasham instead of sarvebhya.
Precisely. The source suggests these aren't usually conscious attempts to evolve Sanskrit. They're often the predictable result of learners trying to map Sanskrit onto the grammatical patterns they know instinctively from their mother tongue, whether that's Hindi, English, Tamil, German, whatever. It's language transfer interference, a common phenomenon in second language acquisition.
So putting this together, you have mostly non-native learners influenced by other languages, and even grammarians relying heavily on texts rather than native intuition.
Right, and that's the context in which the source concludes it is very imprudent to start accepting the incorrect usages of the current times as valid.
It's not just about being a purist then, it's about the source and nature of the current usage.
Exactly. The argument is that the usage we see now doesn't represent a natural, authentic evolution of Sanskrit by fluent, knowledgeable speakers. Instead, it largely reflects the learning process, including common errors and simplifications made by people whose primary linguistic framework is different.
So, citing in AA, grammarians follow usage is misleading in this context.
That's the core of the counter-argument. It's not denying the principle itself ever applied. It's saying the conditions under which it applied historically, a large base of fluent, mostly native speakers whose refined usage could be analyzed, simply don't exist today. Applying the principle now, based on learner usage, is seen as misguided and potentially damaging.
Damaging how?
Well, the implication is that you'd be enshrining learner errors into the grammar, potentially diluting the language's precision and structure before it even has a chance to be properly reestablished based on correct understanding.
Okay, this leads to what you called the lost historical mechanism. The source explains how grammar changes used to happen authentically, differently from now.
Yes, this is a fascinating and crucial part of the argument. The source explains that usage could legitimately inform grammar changes back when Sanskrit was widely spoken, when there was this entire mass of people across huge areas with everyday use of Sanskrit. It was a living language for a large native-speaking population.
A vibrant linguistic ecosystem.
Right. And critically, within that ecosystem, grammar rules were developed or refined based not just on any usage, but on something specific. Shishta Prayoga.
Shishta Prayoga. And that means?
Roughly the usage of the knowledgeable people or the usage of the cultured refined. It wasn't about recording every mistake or regional dialect. It was about the usage of those considered authoritative, exemplary speakers within that native-speaking community. Their way of speaking was the gold standard.
Okay, so grammar followed the usage of the best speakers, the Shishta. Makes sense. But who decided who the Shishta were or what constituted correct usage?
This is the unique part. According to the source, the people who had the ability, the authority to authenticate this correct usage, to really discern true Shishta Prayoga from other speech patterns and then base grammatical refinements on it, were seen in a special light.
So.
The source says they were described as sages or equivalent to sages, a rishi or a signa like a rishi.
Sages, like spiritually advanced figures.
It points to a level of linguistic intuition, a profound understanding of the language's deep structure and spirit, combined with cultural grounding and maybe even a perceived moral or spiritual authority. These ancient grammarians and authorities weren't just technicians cataloging data. They were seen as having the insight to discern the authentic, correct usage within a living tradition. They were the arbiters of Shishta Prayoga.
Wow, that's quite a different picture from modern linguistics.
It is. And the absolute core of the counter-argument, the source's main thrust, is this. Because of the long decline of Sanskrit for generations, where it stopped being a widespread native language, that specific ability, that capacity to authenticate Shishta Prayoga through the profound insight of sage-like figures and adapt grammar based on that kind of usage, well, it's currently lost.
It's not just that we don't have enough speakers. We don't have that specific type of authority and the mechanism that went with it.
Exactly. The whole ecosystem, mass native speakers, recognized Shishta Prayoga, sage-like authenticators, is gone. So just quoting Paitadaran today ignores that the context which gave it meaning is absent. What we have now is mostly learner usage, influenced by other languages. That's fundamentally different from the Shishta Prayoga of native sages.
The gap is huge then. The source concludes we're many generations away from being able to play with and alter the grammar based on usage in the way it might have happened historically?
Yes. The conditions for that specific authentic model of grammar adapting to usage just aren't met in this current revival phase. Trying to apply it now, based on current learner patterns, would be, in this view, a mistake. It wouldn't be adapting to Shishta Prayoga, but rather solidifying the errors and approximations of the learning stage.
Which could potentially water down or damage the very structure they're trying to revive.
That's the concern, yeah. Diluting the profound classical grammar before it's properly reestablished.
Okay, so if changing the grammar to fit current, often incorrect, usage isn't the way forward according to this perspective, what is the proposed path? How should the revival proceed at this stage?
Well, first the source circles back to reaffirm the positive. It repeats that the growth, the awareness, the activity achieved by thousands of selfless people is a tremendous achievement, despite the lack of native speakers and other hurdles. It fully acknowledges the success so far.
It's not dismissing the effort at all.
Not at all. And then, critically, it expresses huge confidence in the existing grammar. It asserts that the foundations of Sanskrit grammar are very profound to take on any usage needs in the modern times.
That's a big statement. It's saying the classical grammar isn't outdated or incapable. It can handle modern life, science, technology, whatever.
That's the assertion. The grammar itself is powerful and flexible enough. The challenge isn't the grammar's limitations, it's the user's ability, especially in a non-native context, to wield it correctly and effectively to express modern concepts. The structure is robust. Mastering its application is the key.
So if the grammar is fine, what should people be doing? Especially the enthusiasts, the grammarians, the teachers.
Their primary role, according to this view, shouldn't be trying to change the grammar to fit how learners are speaking now. Instead, it should be to guide the learners to understand and practice the correct usage.
So the focus shifts completely. It's not about adapting the grammar down to the learners.
No, it's about pedagogy. It's about effective teaching and dedicated learning. Lifting the learners up to meet the standard of the classical grammar. Helping them master its profound structure and rules accurately.
Rather than lowering or changing the grammatical standard to match the current level of usage, which is influenced by other languages anyway.
Exactly. It's about preserving the integrity of this complex, refined system during this delicate revival phase.
And the source extends this responsibility beyond just the experts, right?
Yes, it makes it a collective mission. The final call to action is quite broad. The responsibility of making an effort to learn Sanskrit in a correct way and passing it to the next generation lies with all of us.
All of us involved in the revival. It's not just for teachers or scholars.
Right. It's presented as a shared duty for every individual who cares about Sanskrit's future. Commit to learning it correctly, according to the established classical system, and then ensure that accurate understanding and usage gets passed on faithfully.
The goal, then, is to rebuild a strong foundation of correct usage, person by person, generation by generation, so that future generations inherit the real deal, the profound classical system, not a version distorted by the inevitable inaccuracies of this current learning phase.
That seems to be the essence of the path forward proposed by this side of the argument.
It's fascinating. This specific debate inside the Sanskrit world really does open up much bigger questions, doesn't it? About how any language evolves or is preserved or revived.
Absolutely. You think about other classical languages, Latin, ancient Greek, classical Chinese maybe. How do they maintain their historical integrity while still finding some relevance today? How do you avoid becoming just a museum piece, studied but not lived?
But at the same time, how do you encourage life without losing the very complexity and precision that made the language important in the first place? It's a real tightrope walk.
And for you, the listener, especially if you've ever tried to learn a language, particularly one like Sanskrit, with such a deep history and intricate grammar, this debate really highlights a tension you might feel yourself.
That tension between just wanting to communicate, to get your point across quickly, even if it's messy.
Versus wanting to be accurate, to follow the rules precisely, even if it makes you slower or more hesitant. Fluency versus accuracy.
Right. When you're learning, what do you prioritize? Do you go for speed and communication at all costs, accepting mistakes? Or do you aim for correctness, even if it slows you down? What are the trade-offs, especially for a language valued for its structure?
And that brings up the point about the profound nature of the grammar itself, as the source puts it. If you start simplifying or changing the rules based on common learner errors or approximations,
are you actually losing something valuable? Are you stripping away the nuance, the complexity, the precision that allowed Sanskrit to express such sophisticated ideas for millennia?
is there a risk that in the understandable desire to make it accessible to get more people using it quickly, you inadvertently damage the core structure, the very essence of what you're trying to preserve and revive?
It really is a delicate balance. Accessibility versus fidelity, short-term growth versus long-term integrity.
Definitely.
So, wrapping up this deep dive then, we've seen this incredible, laudable, global effort to revive Sanskrit, something the source greatly celebrates. But we've also explored this significant internal debate. Should the grammar adapt to how people, mostly learners, are using it now, even with the mistakes? Or should the focus be on preserving classical purity?
And the source material we examined presents a very strong case for the latter, at least for now. It argues that the historical principle of grammarians following usage doesn't quite fit the current reality.
Because the necessary conditions, the mass of native speakers providing Shishtaprayoga, the sage-like authorities to authenticate it are missing. That whole mechanism is lost.
Right. Therefore, accepting current incorrect usages, largely driven by learner interference from other languages, is seen as imprudent at this stage.
Instead, the proposed path forward, the responsibility highlighted, is for everyone involved to really focus on learning and teaching Sanskrit correctly, adhering to its existing profound classical structure.
The goal being to preserve that structure faithfully and pass it on intact to future generations, rebuilding the foundation of accurate usage over time.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty provocative thought to chew on, building on all this. In this huge effort to bring a classical language like Sanskrit back to life, what is the ultimate goal? What's the top priority right now?
Is it getting the maximum number of people speaking it as quickly as possible, even if that means simplifying the grammar, making it easier, adapting it to current usage patterns, lowering the barrier to entry, essentially?
Or is it ensuring the absolutely faithful transmission and preservation of the language in its historically correct, complex, profound form? Prioritizing fidelity, even if that makes the path to widespread adoption slower, harder, maybe reaching fewer people in the short term.
How do you navigate that fundamental tension? Balancing the drive for accessibility and modern relevance with the crucial need to maintain the structural integrity, the complexity, the unique value of this ancient system for all the generations yet to come.
It's a challenge that really cuts to the heart of language, culture, history, and what it means to learn and pass on knowledge, something to definitely keep thinking about.